looks like we've got a good number of people here, so I think we can go ahead and get things kicked off here. So first off, thanks again for joining us, everyone, today. Scott, I appreciate having you here. My name is Ben Wilterdink, and I'm the Director of Programs for the Archbridge Institute. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on removing barriers to upward economic mobility. And I'm really happy to have you on today, Scott. So I'll give kind of a brief bio. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with who you are and some of your work, but just in case there are a few who aren't, Scott is a senior fellow and the Director of Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, Scott served as Executive Director of the Joint Economic Committee, where he created the Social Capital Project under Chairman Mike Lee. Before that, Scott has been actively researching poverty and economic mobility for quite a while now, working at institutions such as Manhattan Institute, the Brookings Institution, and the Pew Charitable Trusts. His work has been published and shared very widely. So today, Scott will be talking a bit about his new paper for the Archbridge Institute, which is the third installment in a state-of-the-art primer series on economic mobility. And so this paper focuses on trends in economic mobility in the United States. So Scott, thanks for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to give some opening remarks.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks to everybody for attending. Definitely some familiar names on in the participants list. I especially want to thank the Archbridge Institute for generously funding this research. I signed a contract with them to write 3 papers back in fall of 2016. And not only have they been generous, but they've been very patient. Each of the 3 papers has ended up being individually, maybe the 3 toughest papers I've ever had to write. So a lot has gone into them. Just as a little bit of background, part 1 of this primer was really about trying to assess the most accurate levels of intergenerational mobility in the United States. Each of these papers has tried to be pretty comprehensive, looking at relative mobility, absolute mobility, looking at men and women, looking at various measures, whether they're kind of distributional measures, where you can look at where people start and where they end, or whether they're summary measures where mobility is summarized in a single number. So they've each tried to do all of that. Part 1 was about levels, and I've kind of thought about these papers as being in conversation with a bunch of fantastic mobility researchers. I would say in part 1, I kind of reinforced the results of Bosch Mazumder, who many of you know at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, who has basically argued for years now that mobility levels are much lower than we thought, even in the recent past. It's sort of reinforcing his results as against the results of Raj Chetty and his team, who found much higher levels of mobility using tax data. You can go back to that paper and there's a discussion of that. But I found very low levels of mobility relative to what past research has found. In part 2, I looked at cross-national comparisons, focused on the U.S., but assessing where the U.S. stands in relation to other countries. That paper, I would say, kind of complicated the results of some major mobility scholars, including Mazumder, including Miles Korak, including Marcus Yanti. In that, I found that if you're comparing sons and daughters to their parents' earnings, that you're comparing their earnings to their parents' earnings, the U.S. actually doesn't look too bad versus other countries by measures of sort of rising out of the bottom 5th or bottom 4th or falling from the top 4th. We actually look very comparable to other countries, even Denmark. There's Landerso and Heckman are participating. Surprising paper from them, but it really sort of reinforced a bunch of other research that was kind of hiding in plain view that showed on earnings mobility, U.S. not looking as bad as other countries. Family income mobility, it looks like the U.S. does have less intergenerational mobility than other countries. And now this one is part 3, which is looking at trends in the United States. And I would say this one sort of challenges the results of Mazumder, who has claimed in a few papers that intergenerational mobility has worsened in the United States or fallen in the United States. I don't find that at all. And I spent a lot of time kind of critiquing some of his papers that you can read about in the report. And I would say it also complicates the results of Raj Chetty and his team, who have argued that there have been these big declines in absolute mobility over time, whether you exceed the income of your parents or not. And I argue, I find in my paper that essentially those trends are flat. I argue, that the truth is probably somewhere in between. And we can get to that in a second. So let me just try to very quickly run through a bunch of the main results. The paper, the bulk of it is discussing long-term trends in mobility using a couple of different data sets, the panel study of income dynamics and the national longitudinal surveys, which both allow you to sort of go back to birth cohorts that were born in circa 1950. And you can look as recently as birth cohorts who were born in the early 80s, who are now in sort of early adulthood, approaching middle age today. There are also appendices that discuss longer term trends. I'm not going to talk too much about that here, but one of them does have a very extended critique of an important paper by Aronson and Mazumder from 2008, where I argue that their results probably are not sufficiently reliable, that we ought to really bank on their conclusion that mobility has fallen in the United States. Okay, so just very quickly, I'm just going to run through trends looking at men's earnings mobility, women's earnings mobility, and then men's and women's family income mobility. For men's earnings mobility, comparing father earnings to son earnings, I would say the headline there is relatively little change over time. I look at something called the Income Rank Association, which Chetty and his team call the rank slope. The Spearman rank correlation coefficient is the same thing. That was similar in the PSID, whether you're looking at birth cohorts from 1952 to 59 or birth cohorts from 1976 to 1983. It went from about 0.36 for the earlier cohort to 0.32. Change was not statistically significant. What those numbers mean essentially is that, if you start out with the richest and poorest kids in childhood, who are separated by almost 100 percentiles in childhood, by the time they become adults, they were separated by about 36 percentiles, typically for those 1950s cohorts. By the late 70s, early 80s cohorts, they were separated by 32 percentiles. So, an increase in mobility, but again, probably not sufficiently robust that we would conclude that there has been an increase in mobility over time based on that. If you look at mobility from the bottom fourth or from the top fourth, downward mobility from the top fourth looks to have increased quite a bit. In the earliest cohorts, about 50% of sons who started in the top fourth fell from the top fourth. By the most recent cohorts, that was 69% instead of 50%. Upward mobility from the bottom fourth may have fallen, but that change wasn't statistically significant. The intergenerational elasticity, which is, for the wonks out there know, is the one that was really getting the measure that was getting the most attention for years up until recently. That is essentially the regression coefficient when you regress the log of son earnings on the log of father earnings. It's just a regression coefficient. It largely tells you the percentage change, the percentage difference between two sons that you would expect in adulthood, given a 1% difference in their father's earnings in childhood. That went from 0.32 to 0.31, which is not statistically significant, so no change there. Exceeding your father's earnings, this was kind of the most recent Chetty paper, whether you make more than your father at the same age. That probably declined, but I argue that it's been less than what the Chetty team found. In my results in the PSID, for the early cohort, about 47% of sons exceeded their father's earnings in adulthood. For the most recent cohort, that actually increased to 50%. That's not statistically significant, but the Chetty numbers go from something like 61% down to 42%. So a pretty big decline. Now, what's the difference between those? Well, I argue in the paper that it's not so much a difference in methods or data sets, although there are very big differences in methods. But the real difference is in terms of when each of us are measuring father earnings. I measure them in adolescence because that's when I see them in the data sets I'm using. The Chetty team measures them roughly around age 30. So you can think of it as being closer to when sons are typically born. And that makes a difference because earnings were rising so fast in the 1950s and in the 1960s too, that essentially the bar for exceeding your father's earnings gets a lot higher to clear if you're looking at for that early generation when incomes were rising. The bar is easy to clear when you're looking at father earnings around the time that these early birth cohorts were born, versus if you look at their father's earnings when the kids are adolescents and the fathers have already experienced an earnings increase in between those years. That's a higher bar for kids to pass. And so I tend to find that for the earliest cohorts, absolute mobility was lower than what the Chetty team finds because again, the Chetty team is sort of comparing grown sons to their parents before their fathers experienced these big earnings gains. And I show in the paper why I believe that that's the explanation. I think it's a pretty compelling explanation. And so I conclude that if we had lifetime or sort of childhood over full childhood earnings of fathers, you'd probably still find that absolute mobility has declined over time, contrary to my results, but the decline would not be as large as the Chetty team has found in their results. Okay, earnings mobility for women. A little more complicated, but probably a little change over time. The Income Rank Association comparing mothers and daughters earnings may have risen. It went from 0.06 to 0.19 in the PSID. But if you drop women who don't have any earnings, which is much more important if you're looking at women than it is for looking at men, then the increase is only from 0.16 to 0.21, and it's not statistically significant anymore. It looks like upward mobility from the bottom fourth to the top fourth fell from about 29% for the early cohorts to about 10%. But after dropping zeros, upward mobility out of the bottom fourth may have actually risen from 64% to 74%, although that's not statistically significant either. So you sort of bump up against these complicated stories. The IGE may have increased over time, which would suggest declining mobility versus daughters' earnings versus their father's earnings. That went from 0.09 to 0.27 over these cohorts. That's a pretty large increase, but it's not statistically significant in my data. Versus mothers, the IGE went from 0.08 only to 0.12, also not significant. Exceeding father earnings became likelier for daughters. That went from about 17% of daughters exceeding their father's earnings to about 25% over time. The Chetty team finds a flat trend in contrast. And I think the difference there is about when we're measuring parental earnings. If you compare daughter earnings to their mother's earnings, they became less likely to exceed their mother's earnings over time. For the earlier cohorts, 71% exceeded their mother's earnings. For the more recent one, that was 62%. And that probably relates to the increase in work among women over time. It was much easier to exceed your mother's earnings if your mother was in a cohort where there was a lot of part-time work and a lot of non-work. Okay, very quickly, family income mobility for men. There, we're looking at modest declines in mobility. The IRA may have increased modestly, meaning that mobility may have fallen. In the PSID, the change wasn't statistically significant, went from about 0.49 to 0.55. Again, that's cohorts that were born from 1952 to 59 versus cohorts that were born in 1976 to 83. When I look at family income, I'm able to bring in the national longitudinal surveys. The NLS doesn't have information on parental earnings, at least not across the range of cohorts that I wanted to look at. So here I can introduce a second set of estimates from the NLS. There, the IRA increased also from 0.23 to 0.31 between cohorts born in 1949 to 1951 versus cohorts born 1982 to 84. Upward mobility to the top fourth and downward mobility from the top fourth fell in both data sets over time, a little over the long run. In the PSID, it went from 0.57 to 0.48, which would suggest an increase in mobility, but that wasn't statistically significant. And it's only a 3-point drop if you adjust family incomes for family size. In the NLS, the change was from 0.21 to 0.26. It's actually an increase in the IGE, which means less mobility over time, but that wasn't statistically significant either. And then finally, the likelihood of exceeding parental income was unchanged in my data, but again, it probably did fall, which is what the Chetty team found because of this measurement issue. So I found in the PSID it was flat, about 47%, instead of the Chetty results indicating that it fell from 80% to 53%. And then in the NLS, I found that it went from 51% to 53%, which was not statistically significant either. And then finally, family income mobility for women. Those are kind of, I think, the clearest evidence of declines over time. The IRA increased. In the PSID, it went from 0.36 to 0.50. In the NLS, it went from 0.29 to 0.39. So those are both consistent stories of a fall in relative mobility over time. Upward mobility from the bottom fourth to the top half fell over time in both data sets. The IGE may have declined slightly, which would indicate may have increased slightly, suggesting that mobility may have fallen. Neither of those increases were significant in the PSID or the NLS. And then finally, the likelihood of exceeding parental family income was unchanged or fell. It fell if you use size adjusted income, but otherwise it was unchanged. Again, even the result where I find that it was unchanged probably masks a true decline in absolute mobility if we had measures of family income that went across all of childhood, because then you would find that that absolute mobility was much higher for the earlier birth cohorts, and so it's declined over time. Okay, that was a lot to take in, a lot to say, and I'll end it there, and hopefully we can get a good conversation going.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate that pretty detailed overview, given the scope of the study here. And for attendees, I just want to make a note. You can ask questions via the chat feature, or if you raise your hands, I will try to get to you, and we should be able to unmute you so you can ask it via audio. So start thinking about some of those questions, start thinking about what you'd like to ask Scott, but I'll kick it off. You ran through quite a few different parts of things that you obviously looked at very carefully. From my perspective, I remember seeing the so-called Chetty bomb come out, back a few years ago now. And there were a lot of headlines that basically were saying, the American dream is dead, or it's on life support, it's fading. And I remember you were pushing back on that a little bit at the time. Has your view changed, or do you think that, maybe there's something a little more to that now? Or I guess I can just ask it sort of flat out, is the American dream on life support, or how do you view that?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different ways you can sort of approach the Chetty research. First of all, I'm a giant fan of that whole research team. I think in general they've done really good work, but I think they've gotten some parts of the story wrong. I think my original objection to their research was just in the characterization of absolute mobility being dead. Their headline finding was that it used to be 90% of people exceeded their parents' income if you were born in, say, 1940, and that's fallen to about 50% for kids born in the early 80s. And I sort of interrogated their methods as much as I could, and came to believe that the decline they found was probably right, and at least in direction. And there's been subsequent research that I discussed in the paper that has confirmed that what they did was actually pretty solid. They make some pretty strong assumptions in that paper to get the results that they get. But if anything, subsequent research that I discuss has shown that you can make even stronger assumptions. You basically get the same conclusion. You can sort of assume that that relative mobility in the United States has always and forever been at Scandinavian levels, and just sort of watch what happens to income growth without with the assumption that relative mobility is as high as it is in, say, Denmark and hasn't changed. And you still basically get, this decline over time in absolute mobility. However, at the time, I argued that 50%, that the levels were probably too low for the more recent cohorts. That if you looked at their own paper and you did things like used a better measure of inflation and you adjusted incomes for family size, that more likely the level of absolute mobility was closer to 70, maybe even 75% than 50%. And then in part one of the primer, when I did my own results using the PSID, I found that it was more like 75%. So I think I've been pretty consistently critical there. And of course, the headline that like only 50% exceed their parents' income, that's a much catchier headline than it being 75%. And I do think, unfortunately, the economic journalism that was written about it kind of was too dour. In this latest paper, I think I've sort of concluded that while there was a drop over time in absolute mobility, that it was probably smaller than what the Chetty team suggests, in the sense that if you sort of thought about the income, we think a lot in economics about lifetime income rather than just measuring income in a single year. If you thought about income over an entire childhood, whether kids are able to exceed that or not, then because fewer kids would have exceeded that in these earlier birth cohorts, then were able to exceed their parents' income sort of before income growth really took off, you would find a flatter trend over time. Still a decline, but I do think it's probably been overstated.
Okay, I think overall that sounds like it's a little bit of relatively good news, at least compared to some of the catchier headlines that you were mentioning. One other thing I wanted to ask, you're tracing these trends in economic mobility. One thing that's changed a lot in some of the earlier cohorts up to the more modern ones that you've been studying is the poverty rate, right? So poverty has also been this other piece of the puzzle out here. And that, maybe unlike some of the economic mobility statistics, that one really has changed a lot. So maybe could you briefly cover how that's changed and then sort of tie that into how you see that fitting in with this economic mobility data in terms of how that should shape our understanding of kind of the more full picture?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think the contrast is really interesting because most researchers who study poverty trends would agree that poverty has fallen quite a bit over time. Now, you'll get disagreement about why that is, the extent to which it's the expanded safety net versus, in the last 30 years, the safety net that has promoted work and independence, how much of it is just, income growth and economic growth, raising incomes over time. All of those, I think, are important pieces of the story, but poverty has fallen a lot over time. I mean, I think the best numbers I've seen come from Rich Burkhauser and Kevin Corinth and some other scholars on that team, who basically argue that, if the poverty rate in 1963 was 19.5%, which is what the official poverty rate was back then, and you use a consistent definition of income and a consistent poverty threshold updated for the increase in the cost of living, that 19.5% falls to 2.5% today. So really dramatic. I've done research showing that even if you're sort of looking at the kids of single mothers, child poverty among those kids. It's an all-time low today. Now you contrast that with the relatively flat trends in intergenerational mobility out of poverty, or in some cases declining upward mobility out of poverty. To me, it says that if policymakers want to reduce poverty, that may entail one set of policies, but they might not be expected to be the same set of policies that would increase upward mobility out of poverty. And I think as recent as the pandemic, we saw an example of that. We kept poverty rates basically at their historically low level during 2020 because of this massive infusion of cash that happened in 2020 and also in early 2021. But on the other hand, what happened to kids in school? We couldn't figure out how to get kids back in school or to make distance learning or learning from home safe. And so you saw these big learning losses, especially among kids in poor zip codes, as the Chetty team has shown. So that's a case, where we prioritized one thing and we succeeded there, but we took our eye off something else, thinking, I guess, that reducing poverty was also going to be good for upward mobility, and I just don't think that's a very strong case at all. Now, I should say that this is a little complicated because nearly all of the mobility research that we have is looking only at a limited set of transfers, and it's generally pre-tax incomes. And that's really sort of a function of kind of data weaknesses that are out there. There's literally only been, for US studies that I can think of, 2 or 3 that try to incorporate taxes or that try to incorporate more transfers. It's possible if we had better income measures in our mobility studies that we would find a different trend, but I don't think we would actually. I've actually looked at trends in market income mobility, which is take out all transfers. In the PSID and the NLS, there are cash transfers that are included in that income measure: unemployment, Social Security, welfare, cash welfare benefits, SSI, disability benefits, those sort of things. If you take all those out, you don't see a trend that looks much different than what I presented to you.
Okay. Well, we do have one question in the queue here from John Mosina. So people often move from one city or state to another to take advantage of economic opportunity in a particular place at that point in time. Do you see any connection between what you're seeing in economic mobility trends and the multi-decade fall in internal migration rates within the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wrote a report a few years ago when I was at the Manhattan Institute. It was called "When Moving Matters," which was sort of a compromise title because I wasn't persuaded moving did matter for intergenerational economic mobility. But I tried to look at the relationship between residential mobility trends and in economic mobility trends. And I'm not even recalling what I found. You get to a certain age and you start forgetting what you found in previous papers. I don't think there was a very strong link between the two. But then again, I also sort of found residential mobility trends that were a little bit in contrast to this conventional wisdom, which is that that residential mobility has fallen quite a bit. And I was using a measure that compared where you lived as an adult to where you were born, and finding, that the decline in residential mobility wasn't actually that large either. So I don't know, intuitively, it makes a lot of sense, over American history. You think of Western migration, you think of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the urban North. There was also a similar migration of kind of rural Appalachian whites to cities in the North. Over time, it seems like migration has been really important for upward mobility. But I don't know that anybody's really established that very well in the data. Partly because there are all these measurement issues. So I don't have a better answer than that. But.
Okay, well, I want to kind of take it back a little bit and think about some of the sort of the building blocks of economic mobility. So we know some things about this. Social capital is obviously a big part of it, something you've worked on quite a bit. That seems to me, at least partly a continuation from the old sort of Reformicon movement to kind of bring that back again. So I wonder, when you were working on that stuff a little more in a concerted way, how have you revisited any of those ideas or proposals, or in light of this new research that you've been doing over the past few years, specifically on economic mobility? When you think about human capital or social capital, some of that really seemed targeted by the reforms that the Reformicons were proposing. Do you think that we sort of missed the boat on that, or would you say that you would have some different ideas looking back now? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I guess, so I think, obviously I spent, when I started the primer, I was not working for the Joint Economic Committee Social Capital Project. And I think about 3 months in, I ended up taking that position. And so in the interim between part 1 and part 3 of the primer, I've spent a lot of time researching social capital. And that certainly made me feel, like more concerned about social capital trends. If people know my work, a lot of what I end up writing about is along the lines of, things are not as bad as you think. Things are not getting worse as much as you think. Most of the social capital trends that we've got good data for, don't look good, and have definitely become more concerned about those sorts of problems over time. Declines in everything from obviously like the stability of family life and single parenthood and out of wedlock births, but also, confidence in institutions, general trust in each other, participation in organizations, interactions with neighbors, even things like working with hanging out with coworkers after work, has declined quite a bit over time. Church attendance, pretty much across the board, with just a couple of exceptions. Things look like they've gotten worse over time. So I do think those are important. Now, how important would they be for economic mobility? Some of them, I think, would be quite important. I think, in particular, the family declines, the sort of increases in single parenthood over time probably have been harmful. That is complicated to look at empirically, because if you have a single parent, it's in some ways certainly easier to exceed your single parent's income than it is to exceed your dual parental income. But I think that's probably really important for intergenerational mobility. I do think where the mobility research should go next is getting a better handle on what the most important factors are for increasing intergenerational mobility. I think the Chetty team did everyone a great service by kind of running these correlations and sort of showing, here are the top 5 things that are correlated with intergenerational mobility. They even have a subsequent paper where they try to correlate these various factors with the causal effect of a place in terms of economic mobility. That paper was a lot more technical, didn't get as much attention as their first paper, but in some ways it's more rigorous from a causal perspective. But really, at the end of the day, when I worked at Pew on the economic mobility project, over a decade ago at this point, people were always asking us, what are the top 3 things to promote upward mobility? And I don't think we have a research base that really lets us say that with any kind of confidence. So that's a real gap in our understanding of mobility.
Well, on that cheery note, I do think, you wouldn't know that given the proclamations that we hear from a lot of, contemporary politicians, that kind of on either side, who are sort of, it feels like we're sort of feeling our way around this problem a little bit, but we're still, like you mentioned, we're still kind of empirically in the dark. Some things we do know, right, though. So like the role of education, some things we can sort of hint at. So what would you feel most confident about saying is sort of the building block of economic mobility, upward economic mobility?
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, if we're concerned about upward mobility of poor kids, which is really, what my, biggest concern is in all of this, we have to deal with inequalities in early childhood environments, learning environments. Kids start kindergarten with, these very large gaps in test scores. Test scores at age 4 or 5 or even younger, are much better measured these days than they were, a generation or two ago. And those gaps are real and they're important, and they persist. And so, I do tend to agree with Jim Heckman that we ought to be focusing a lot on early childhood. I guess I'm probably a little bit less optimistic than Jim is about our ability to implement a successful national program. But I think we ought to be trying a lot harder than we are now. I think Head Start, is not a program that ought to make us wildly optimistic. But I think we ought to be funding. I've proposed this in the past. Funding heavily an Office of Opportunity in the White House that would seed local experiments to reduce learning gaps when kids enter school. And my pitch to conservatives would be 19 out of 20 things you try are not going to work, and that's actually going to, if you want more people to understand the limits of what government programs can do, that will be demonstrated by a program like this. But we ought to also all be cheering, and looking for the 1 out of 20 that do work, which we could expand. When Google or MasterCard, does all their A/B testing, experimenting with different ways of marketing and serving ads to people or whatever, 19 out of 20 times, like what they try doesn't really work. But they're looking for the 1 out of 20 times it does work, and that's really what we need to find. And it's an important enough goal that we ought to pump a lot of money into it, knowing that at the end of the day, a lot of it, is not going to have a very good return. So I would focus on that. I would focus on trying to reduce single parenthood, which we don't really know how to do very well yet. But I've proposed a number of changes to social welfare policy that potentially could move the needle there a bit. Those would probably be the two buckets that I'd bank on the most.
Yeah, seem like good places to start, even if maybe what works in one place may not work in another. So I guess we'll have to find that out. But I do want to move to, we have another question here from my colleague, Dr. Clay Rutledge. So I'll read it out loud here. So I know your focus is on economic mobility, but I'm curious if you think we are underemphasizing other indicators of human flourishing. For instance, a poor person today has a number of advantages over even a rich person decades ago. New medicine, more access to college education, different technologies. In other words, have you thought about a broader approach to thinking about mobility? And I'll just kind of add on to that question. I think it's in the same vein as, a lot of the economic mobility measurements are focused on income level, rather than, say, other quality of life sort of style indicators. So I guess another kind of way to think about that question might be is, should we be caring less about economic mobility as other indicators that are important to us get better?
Yeah, these are really good questions. I guess so first to take Clay's question, I think. I think mobility indicators don't tell you everything that's relevant about, how well the nation is doing or how well policy is doing. Just in the same way that poverty is at an all-time low, median household incomes are at an all-time high. Median earnings and median hourly wages for men and women are both basically at all-time highs. The growth for men has not been as strong as it has been in earlier decades, but nevertheless, people are better off than Americans have ever been, and so that's something to celebrate and to care about. apart from either relative mobility or absolute mobility. I talk about in I think a couple different places in the primer, where in regard to absolute mobility, there's probably a trade-off there between sort of income levels and absolute mobility. In other words, even though kids born in 1940 had more absolute mobility than kids born today will, very, very few of us would trade, right? Very few of us say, oh, I'd rather have the 90% chance of doing better than my parents, but being born into the Depression, than being born today and having, maybe a 65% chance of doing better than my parents. Similarly, it's almost certainly the case that China, is a very poor country that's experienced rapid development, has had more upward absolute mobility than the United States has. But would we trade places and sort of wish to have been born in rural China so that we could have had that great upward mobility? And then the last example would be, that poor kids have more absolute mobility than rich kids do, because when your parents are very poor, it's easier to exceed that income than when your parents are very rich. But we would not trade places. Those of us who were fortunate not to be born poor, we wouldn't say, "Boy, I wish I had been born poor, so I'd had better absolute mobility." So it's definitely, there are different facets to think about. Even the metric of intergenerational mobility, this is something I talk about in part 1 of the primer, is an imperfect proxy for opportunity. I think when I talk about mobility, I'm sort of thinking of it as a measure of opportunity. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? We don't actually know what the most just intergenerational mobility level would be, because people's preferences differ. Income is not the only thing that matters to people. But what I will say is that, the way that mobility is patterned in the United States, in particular, the big black-white gaps in intergenerational mobility, unless you're prepared to sort of come up with a story about why it is that 1 in 5 African-American adults is in their 3rd generation of being in the bottom 5th, while that's true of only 1 in 20 white adults. Unless you can come up with a theory about how that's just reflecting different preferences, then I think we need to really worry about mobility gaps of those sorts.
Okay, well, I think that's probably where we'll have to sort of start to close it for today. I just want to remind everyone you can see the full report at www.archbridgeinstitute.org. And I do want to kind of close here with one question, Scott, one final question. For people who are maybe, on the state level, policymakers, or in the local level, people who are very involved in their communities, but maybe they don't have a lot of time to dive into some of the more detailed academic literature. What's sort of the one big takeaway that you would want them to know about economic mobility, sort of as it stands right now?
Yeah, I think the thing that I would emphasize is that so much of the evidence out there is just a lot more complicated than what people hear about. It would be much nicer if it was a cleaner story. I would have had to spend much less time and many few words describing the results if it were true. But it really is just a very complicated story. I think that if people are thinking about, well, what is the intergenerational mobility problem in the United States, I would encourage them, in addition to reading the 3 parts of this primer that I wrote, to read the 2 papers that I wrote with Richard Reeves and some other colleagues that are on black-white mobility differences. And there, I think, it's just a clear story where there are just very large upward mobility gaps between whites and African Americans that are longstanding. 60 years after the civil rights movement sort of peaked. We've not made a ton of progress on those metrics, and that's really something that's shameful, and that is clear cut. And if the solutions aren't clear cut, the problem is, and that we ought to be directing a lot more attention to that.
All right. With that, Scott, thank you very much for being with us today. And I hope that we can kind of continue the conversation another time.
Thanks very much, Ben.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today.